May 8, 1945, just after midday over Brno, Czechoslovakia. A lone Messerschmitt Bf-109 dropped from altitude and opened fire on a Soviet Yak-9 fighter. The German pilot's aim perfect as always, and the Soviet aircraft tumbled earthward, trailing smoke and flame. The German pilot pulled up, checked his surroundings, and turned for home, knowing this was his 352nd aerial victory, and knowing Germany had already surrendered hours earlier. The war was over, Hitler was dead, and Erich Hartmann had just become the deadliest fighter pilot in the history of aerial warfare, a record that stands today and will almost certainly never be broken. But Hartmann's war wasn't over. 10.5 years in Soviet prison camps awaited him, with years of torture and starvation and interrogation that would test him in ways combat never had. And by the time he finally came home, his infant son would be dead and buried, while his wife would have endured more than a decade of not knowing if he was alive or dead. This is the story of the Blonde Knight of Germany, the man the Soviets called the Black Devil, the pilot who flew 1,404 combat missions and was never shot down by enemy fire. This is the prisoner who survived the Gulag without breaking, and the officer who sacrificed his career to speak truth when his superiors demanded silence. This is the story of Erich Hartmann. April 19, 1922, brought Erich Alfred Hartmann into a world still reeling from the disaster of the First World War. Born in Weissach, Württemberg, in southwest Germany, at the worst possible time. His father Alfred was a physician who struggled to make a living in the economic catastrophe gripping Weimar Germany, where hyperinflation made money worthless and hunger stalked the streets. While his mother, Elisabeth Wilhelmina Machtolf, was one of the early female glider pilots in Germany, with a passion for aviation that she would pass directly to her son. When Erich was just 3 years old, the family fled Germany entirely and moved to Changsha, China, where Dr. Hartmann hoped to find work and stability far from the economic collapse and political violence tearing the fatherland apart. The Hartmanns spent several years in China trying to build a new life, but in 1928 the Chinese Civil War erupted around them and forced them to pack up and return to Germany when Erich was 6, and the family settled back in Württemberg, where Dr. Hartmann resumed his medical practice, and Elizabeth returned to her gliders. From age 14, Erich spent his free time at the local glider club where his mother taught him to fly, and he took to it naturally, with an instinctive feel for the controls and an understanding of how air moved over wings. Gliding taught him to read the sky, to feel the wind, and to make every movement count because there was no engine to save you from mistakes, and these lessons would serve him well when the controls had guns attached. Medicine was his goal, planned to become a doctor like his father and spend his life healing people. But fate and history had other plans because war was coming, whether anyone wanted it or not. October 1st, 1940, at age 18, it found Hartmann joining the Luftwaffe and beginning the long process of transforming from a glider pilot into a fighter pilot. Training was rigorous and demanding, with ground school covering navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, and tactics, while flight training progressed through basic aircraft to advanced trainers and finally to combat types. And Hartmann proved himself a talented pilot during training, though not exceptional, competent, and careful, and willing to learn. By 1942, he'd completed the full fighter pilot course and received his posting. October 1942 sent Hartmann to Jagdgeschwader 52, known simply as JG-52, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, and a unit already thick with aces and veterans. The posting meant the Eastern Front, where Germany and the Soviet Union were locked in a titanic struggle. And JG-52 operated in the southern sector, covering everything from the Black Sea to the Caucasus Mountains, while flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force. When Hartmann arrived at his new squadron, he was placed under the supervision of experienced pilots who would teach him how to survive. Oberfeldwebel Alfred Grislowski became his first mentor, a veteran with dozens of victories who took the young officer under his wing, despite Hartmann technically outranking him. Because among fighter pilots, official rank meant almost nothing compared to experience and combat time. Grislowski put Hartmann through intensive mock combats and practice flights to test his skills and identify his weaknesses. And after a few days, the veteran admitted that while Hartmann had much to learn about tactics, he was undeniably talented at actually flying the aircraft. Then came assignment as wingman to Walter Krupinski, an ace who would become his mentor, his friend, and eventually a lifelong companion. October 14, 1942, brought Hartmann's first combat mission, and it went exactly as badly as first missions usually did for rookie pilots who thought they knew more than they actually did. Krupinski and Hartmann spotted 10 Soviet aircraft during a patrol, and instead of following his leader's example and stalking patiently from above, Hartmann's youthful impatience took over, and he dove straight into the enemy formation alone, opening fire from too far away with terrible aim, not scoring a single hit despite burning through ammunition. Baker and almost colliding with a Soviet fighter when he misjudged his closure rate. Pulling up above the clouds to escape retaliation from the Soviet fighters he'd just alerted to his presence, Hartmann realized too late that in his panic and inexperience, he'd used full throttle the entire time and now his fuel gauges read empty. With a dry tank and no airfield within gliding range, all he could do was pick the least terrible spot and crash land, hoping to survive the impact and the embarrassment. And he walked away from the wreck uninjured. But his commanding officer was less than impressed and grounded him for 3 days of hard labor, giving the rookie time to think about following orders and not getting himself killed through stupidity. Hartmann learned from the experience the way good pilots do, and he started actually listening to Krupinski's advice about how to fight and survive in the air over the Eastern Front. November 5, 1942, brought his first aerial victory when he shot down an IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft from the Soviet 7th Guards Sturmovik Aviation Regiment, with the kill confirmed by witnesses on the ground. But victories came slowly in those early months because he was still learning, still developing, still making mistakes that more experienced pilots had already learned to avoid. 3 months passed before his second victory, and by the end of 1942, Hartmann's total stood at exactly 2 kills, not exactly the performance of a future ace and nowhere near the numbers that veteran pilots in JG-52 were racking up daily. Some pilots questioned whether the young officer would ever amount to anything as a fighter pilot or whether he had what it took to survive and succeed on the Eastern Front, where Soviet numerical superiority meant German pilots were always outnumbered and always one mistake away from death. But Hartmann kept flying and kept learning, and gradually he absorbed the lessons that Krupinski and the other veterans taught him about how dogfighting was wasteful and dangerous, about how turning and burning with enemy fighters consumed fuel and ammunition and time while accomplishing little. Altitude was life because the pilot above could always dictate the terms of engagement. Patience paid off because stalking prey from a position of advantage beat rushing in blindly. And most importantly, he developed the tactical approach that would define his entire combat career and make him the deadliest pilot in history. Hartmann called his method see, decide, attack, break, and it was brutally simple in concept, though difficult to execute properly. First, see the enemy from a distance and from altitude by spotting them before they spot you and maneuvering into a superior position. Then decide whether to engage based on the tactical situation, the enemy's numbers and positions, your fuel and ammunition state, and your advantage. Third, attack from close range with overwhelming violence and precision by getting so close that missing was physically impossible, and fourth, break off immediately and escape before the enemy could react by never staying to dogfight or celebrate. See, the attack phase was where Hartmann differed most dramatically from other pilots who typically opened fire from 200 or 300 meters away, long range where deflection shooting was difficult and most rounds missed. Hartmann got close, terrifyingly close, waiting until the enemy aircraft filled his entire windscreen before pressing the trigger at 20 meters or sometimes less, point-blank range, where even a mediocre shot couldn't miss, and where a single burst was enough to destroy any aircraft. His famous advice to young pilots was simple and direct. When he fills the entire windscreen, you can't possibly miss. This extreme close-range approach was dangerous, because at those distances there was almost no reaction time if something went wrong. And Hartmann would crash land 16 times during his career, after being hit by debris from aircraft he'd just destroyed or after suffering mechanical failures. But he was never shot down by enemy fire, never defeated in air-to-air combat, never forced to bail out because an enemy pilot outfought him, and that record speaks to both his skill and his tactical discipline. The minimal ammunition philosophy extended from his close-range attacks because when you fired from 20 meters, you needed very few bullets to kill. A story from later in the war, told by a Hungarian mechanic who serviced Hartmann's aircraft, captures this perfectly when Hartmann scrambled to intercept Soviet attackers near Budapest one morning. Airborne for about 20 to 30 minutes, he came back for breakfast while the mechanic checked and refueled his aircraft. And he reported 3 confirmed kills, but when the mechanic inspected the guns, he found that only 3 bullets had been fired, 1 bullet per kill. Confronting Hartmann incredulously about this, the ace just laughed and said, "You do it many times and you become good at anything. We should not waste ammo now, so I get in close and just tap the trigger." Early 1943 found Hartmann still building his score slowly and steadily, while learning from every mission and every engagement, and by summer his total had climbed. But he was still far from the top aces in his unit. Then came July 1943, and the Battle of Kursk, the massive German offensive that would become the largest tank battle in history and would feature some of the most intense aerial combat of the entire war. And the skies over Kursk were thick with aircraft as both sides threw everything they had into the battle, creating what German fighter pilots called a target-rich environment. July 7, 1943 brought Hartmann's first ace-in-a-day performance by shooting down 7 Soviet aircraft in a single day's combat, 3 IL-2 Sturmoviks and 4 LAGG fighters. And this breakthrough seemed to flip a switch in his mind because suddenly everything clicked and the kills started coming fast. By August 1943, his total stood at 50 victories, which was a respectable number that marked him as a successful pilot. But then the floodgates truly opened, and he claimed 48 more kills in August alone. August 20th, 1943, brought Hartmann's 90th victory, establishing him as one of the most dangerous pilots in JG-52. And on September 20th, 1943, he crossed the psychological barrier of 100 kills by claiming 4 victories in a single day and ending with 101 total. Becoming the 54th Luftwaffe pilot to achieve the century mark, the kills kept coming as Hartmann refined his tactics and his confidence grew. October 1943 brought another 33 victories as the young ace racked up multiple kills on mission after mission, and on October 29, 1943, at age 21 with 148 victories to his credit, Erich Hartmann was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military decoration, and one that earlier in the war would have come after just 25 or 50 kills. But by late 1943, the standards had risen dramatically as the Luftwaffe produced more and more aces, and Hartmann had to prove himself far beyond what would have been required in 1940. And the Knight's Cross ceremony marked him as an ace among aces, a rising star in the Luftwaffe fighter force. The ceremony validated everything he'd learned over the previous year of combat, proved that his tactics worked, and that close-range attack combined with disciplined break-off was the key to both survival and success. By the end of 1943, Hartmann's score stood at 159 victories, and he was just getting started because 1944 would bring numbers that seemed almost impossible and would cement his place as the deadliest pilot in history. And the Eastern Front was a grinding war of attrition where Soviet numerical superiority meant there were always more targets, always more missions, always more opportunities to add to his tally. And Erich Hartmann was ready to take full advantage of that terrible arithmetic. Winter 1943 gave way to 1944, and Erich Hartmann began the new year with a fury that would produce numbers no fighter pilot had ever achieved before or would ever achieve again. Between January and February, he claimed 50 kills in just 60 days of flying, an average of nearly 1 victory per day when he was actually airborne. And this wasn't the desperate flailing of a pilot taking wild shots at anything that moved, but rather the precise execution of his see-decide attack break method against target after target. March 2, 1944, with 202 victories officially credited, brought Hartmann the Oak Leaves addition to his Knight's Cross, the next level of the award that fewer and fewer pilots would ever reach. 21 years old, and still young enough that many of the ground crew called him Booby, German for boy, and yet he'd already achieved more aerial victories than all but a handful of pilots in the entire history of aviation. And the Oak Leaves ceremony brought congratulations from senior officers and recognition from the highest levels of the Luftwaffe. But Hartmann simply returned to his squadron and kept flying because the war wasn't stopping for awards ceremonies. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 now carried distinctive nose art that would become famous across the Eastern Front. A black tulip painted on a yellow background that stood out dramatically against the standard camouflage scheme. The tulip became his personal marking, and JG-52's ground crew made sure it was carefully maintained and repainted whenever his aircraft suffered damage. But the problem with distinctive markings in combat was that they made you instantly recognizable to the enemy, and that recognition could work against you. Soviet pilots began to notice the black tulip and began to associate it with the German pilot who appeared from nowhere and killed with uncanny precision, and word spread through Soviet fighter regiments that engaging the black tulip meant death. They started calling him Cherny Chort, the Black Devil, a nickname that mixed fear with grudging respect, and Soviet squadron commanders began ordering their pilots to avoid combat with the tulip-marked Messerschmitt whenever possible. This presented Hartmann with an unexpected tactical problem, because while the fear was gratifying in a professional sense, it meant Soviet pilots would break off and flee the moment they spotted his aircraft, denying him opportunities to engage and reducing his effectiveness. Trying to solve this, he had his wingman fly the distinctively marked aircraft while he flew a standard paint scheme, hoping to lure Soviet fighters into range, but the Soviets had learned to be cautious and steered wide of any formation that included the tulip, regardless of which aircraft Hartmann actually occupied. At the beginning of 1944, Hartmann had the black tulip removed entirely and returned to flying aircraft with standard Luftwaffe camouflage. Trading his personal fame for tactical effectiveness. Cloaked in anonymity, once more he shot down 50 Soviet machines in January and February, despite being grounded by inclement weather for almost half those months. And the kills kept accumulating at a pace that seemed impossible to anyone not witnessing it firsthand. Spring 1944 brought the Soviet Crimean offensive as the Red Army pushed to recapture the Crimean Peninsula from German forces and JG-52 flew constant missions to support the retreating Wehrmacht units and contest Soviet air superiority. Hartmann claimed many more victories during this desperate defensive campaign, though the strategic situation was clearly deteriorating for Germany, and on May 8, 1944, JG-52 had to abandon the region entirely as the German defense collapsed and Soviet forces overran their airfields. Relocation to the Romanian border meant continued operations defending the vital Ploiești oil fields. And this is where Erich Hartmann would encounter American aircraft for the first time in his combat career. May 21, 1944, he brought United States Army Air Force's bombers attacking the Ploiești refineries, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, sleek silver American machines that were among the finest fighters produced by any nation during the war, and Hartmann and his squadron scrambled to intercept. In the ensuing combat, he claimed his first American kill when he shot down a P-51 from extreme close range using his standard tactics. The engagement proved that his methods worked regardless of what aircraft the enemy flew, whether Soviet Yaks and Lagis or American Mustangs, because physics and geometry didn't change based on nationality. But the Americans and their powerful Mustangs proved more dangerous than the Soviet pilots he'd been fighting for 2 years. He better trained and more aggressive and equipped with aircraft that could match or exceed the Bf-109's performance in many flight regimes. During a later engagement with American fighters, Hartmann found himself in serious trouble when P-51s forced him into an extended chase that consumed his fuel and ammunition. And with his tanks dry and no rounds remaining, he had to bail out of his aircraft and parachute down, while American fighters circled overhead. As Hartmann descended under his parachute canopy, one P-51 pilot flew close to him, close enough that Hartmann could see the American's face clearly, and the two pilots exchanged looks across the few dozen meters separating them, and the American could have strafed him easily, could have killed a helpless enemy parachuting to Earth. But instead, the Mustang pilot simply waggled his wings in salute and flew away, an act of chivalry that Hartmann never forgot. July 2, 1944, with 239 victories credited, brought Hartmann the sword's addition to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves, making him one of fewer than 200 recipients of this high honor out of millions who served in the German military. The award ceremony was brief because there was no time for elaborate celebrations when Soviet forces were advancing on all fronts and the Luftwaffe was being ground down by attrition despite the high scores individual aces were achieving. August 1944 would become Hartmann's most phenomenal month of the entire war, a period when his scoring reached levels that seemed to defy belief even to those who witnessed it. August 17, 1944, brought his 274th aircraft kill, and in doing so, he surpassed Gerhard Barkhorn to become the highest-scoring fighter ace in the world, a title he would hold for the rest of the war, and indeed forever, since no subsequent conflict has produced comparable opportunities for individual pilots to accumulate such numbers. August 23, 1944, saw Hartmann achieve another ace-in-a-day performance when he claimed 8 victories in 3 separate combat missions, bringing his total to 290 kills, and this was merely the prelude to what would come the following day. Flying 2 combat missions south of the Radom-Lublin area in Poland on August 24, 1944, Erich Hartmann shot down 11 aircraft in a single day's combat, an achievement so extraordinary that it earned its own designation as a double ace-in-a-day performance. The 11 kills brought his total to 301 victories and represented his greatest single-day achievement, a performance that would be referenced twice in the Wehrmacht Daily Bulletin as proof of German martial prowess, despite the increasingly desperate strategic situation. Every single aerial victory claimed by any pilot in his unit on both August 23rd and August 24th was credited to Hartmann alone. And the sheer dominance of these 2 days illustrated both his tactical mastery and the target-rich environment the Eastern Front had become. August 25, 1944, with 301 victories officially credited, brought 22-year-old Erich Hartmann the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. The highest regularly awarded military decoration in the Third Reich and an honor bestowed upon only 27 recipients during the entire war. Youngest person to receive the diamonds and the last, the award was personally presented by Adolf Hitler himself in a ceremony at the Reich Chancellery. The meeting with Hitler was brief, and Hartmann found the experience surreal, shaking hands with the dictator whose decisions had led Germany into this catastrophic war, and standing for photographs while Hitler praised his achievements and the propaganda apparatus documented everything for public consumption. Hartmann received the physical award and the congratulations of senior Nazi officials, and then he returned to his unit because combat operations never stopped regardless of who was being decorated. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, immediately grounded Hartmann after the diamond ceremony out of fear that losing such a propaganda asset would damage German morale. But Hartmann lobbied successfully to be reinstated as a combat pilot, because he had no desire to sit out the war in safety while his comrades and his country fought. Within days he was back in the cockpit flying missions over the collapsing Eastern Front, adding to his score even as the strategic situation grew more hopeless with each passing week. September 10, 1944, brought a brief respite from combat when Hartmann married his longtime girlfriend Ursula Petsch, called Usch by everyone who knew her, in a ceremony at Bad Wiessee with witnesses including his friend and fellow ace major Gerhard Barkhorn and Hauptmann Wilhelm Botz. The wedding celebration lasted exactly 10 days, Hartmann's authorized leave period, and it was the last time he would see his wife for more than 10 years, because when he returned to duty, the final catastrophic phase of the war was beginning. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Hartmann continued flying combat missions as Soviet forces pushed deeper into German-held territory, and the Luftwaffe's situation became increasingly desperate. Fuel shortages limited operations, replacement aircraft arrived slowly, and experienced pilots were being killed faster than new ones could be trained. But Hartmann survived through a combination of skill, tactical discipline, and an amount of luck that couldn't last forever. His victory total climbed past 320, then 330, then 340 as winter arrived, and 1944 gave way to 1945. And the year 1944 had brought Hartmann 172 aerial victories, an all-time single-year record that would never be matched. By the time the calendar turned, he was approaching a number that seemed almost mythical, and the question wasn't whether he would reach 350 victories, but rather how long the war would last and what would happen when Germany finally collapsed. January through April 1945 saw Hartmann flying mission after mission as the Third Reich entered its death throes, with Soviet armies closing in from the east while American and British forces advanced from the west. The Luftwaffe was being annihilated on both fronts with fuel so scarce that many aircraft sat grounded for lack of gasoline and pilots so exhausted that mistakes were inevitable. And Hartmann kept flying because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and because abandoning his squadron was unthinkable, regardless of how hopeless the situation had become. May 8, 1945, hours before Germany's official surrender took effect, brought Erich Hartmann's final combat mission of the war. Flying over the skies near Brno, in what is now the Czech Republic, he spotted a Soviet Yak-9 fighter and executed his standard attack by diving from altitude and closing to point-blank range before firing a single precise burst, and the Yak-9 fell from the sky as Hartmann's 352nd and final aerial victory. When he landed back at his airfield, he learned that hostilities had officially ceased and the war was over. His final statistics were staggering and would never be approached, much less exceeded. Flying 1,404 combat missions over the course of 2.5 years, he participated in aerial combat on 825 separate occasions and was credited with shooting down 352 Allied aircraft, including 345 Soviet planes and 7 American, and he had been forced to crash land his fighter 16 times due to mechanical failure or damage from debris of aircraft he'd shot down. But he had never been shot down by direct enemy action, never defeated in air-to-air combat, never bailed out because an enemy pilot had outfought him. Of all his achievements, the one Hartmann took the most pride in was that he had never lost a wingman, never allowed any pilot flying on his wing to be shot down during the hundreds of missions they'd flown together. Learned from Krupinski that a leader's first duty was protecting those who flew with him. And despite the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front, where death was common and survival unusual, every pilot assigned as Hartmann's wingman had come home alive. But May 8, 1945, didn't bring peace for Erich Hartmann. Realizing his airfield was within range of advancing Soviet forces and that JG-52 needed to surrender before they were overrun, he led his remaining aircraft west toward American lines, hoping to give himself and his men up to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets, and they succeeded in surrendering to United States Army forces. For a brief time, Hartmann thought the war truly was over and that he would soon be going home to Ush. He was catastrophically wrong. The Americans held the surrendered German pilots and ground crews in a large open-air compound for several days, with conditions deteriorating as the number of prisoners swelled to 50,000. And then on May 14, 1945, in accordance with the Yalta agreements that required airmen who'd fought Soviet forces to be handed over directly to them, the Americans transferred their German prisoners to Red Army control. Hartmann watched as American guards led him and his men toward Soviet-controlled territory, with some Americans turning a blind eye to escape attempts, and a few even providing food and maps to help prisoners flee. But Hartmann refused to abandon the men he'd commanded and walked into Soviet captivity alongside them. Witnessing Soviet soldiers separating German women and girls from the men, what followed was a brutal orgy of rape and violence as Red Army troops assaulted the helpless women, while the outnumbered Americans tried unsuccessfully to intervene until Soviet soldiers fired into the air and threatened to kill any American who interfered. This was Hartmann's introduction to Soviet justice, and it would only get worse from here. He didn't know it yet, but he would spend the next 10.5 years in Soviet prison camps and gulags, enduring interrogation and torture and starvation. And during those years, his infant son would be born and would die without him ever knowing the child existed. The war in the air was over. The war for survival was just beginning. The first thing the Soviets did after taking custody of the German prisoners was attempt to recruit them, and Erich Hartmann quickly became a priority target for conversion because his skills and reputation made him valuable. Soviet intelligence officers approached him with offers to join the East German Air Force, promised him positions of authority and respect in the new communist regime, and made it clear that cooperation would mean freedom and comfort, while resistance would bring consequences. Hartmann refused every offer without hesitation, asked to spy on fellow German officers, to provide information on who held anti-Soviet views and who might be amenable to recruitment, and when he said no, the interrogators gave him 10 days of solitary confinement in a chamber measuring 4 feet by 9 feet by 6 feet. Moimbach, where he slept on bare concrete, received only bread and water, and was given time to reconsider his unwillingness to cooperate with Soviet will. The solitary confinement didn't break him, so the Soviets tried different approaches. On one occasion, interrogators threatened to kidnap and murder his wife Ursula, describing in detail how they would find her in Germany and what would happen to her if Hartmann continued refusing to work with them, And what Hartmann didn't know during these threats was that Ursula had given birth to their son, Erich Peter, in 1945, shortly after his capture. A child he would never meet because the boy would die in 1948 at age 3, while his father remained imprisoned. The death kept secret from Hartmann for years. The interrogations about technical matters proved especially volatile. Soviet intelligence wanted detailed information about German aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter that had appeared late in the war. And they pressed Hartmann repeatedly for specifications and performance data. And during one such interrogation, a Soviet officer became frustrated with Hartmann's refusal to provide useful information and struck him across the face with a wooden cane. Hartmann's response was immediate and violent as he grabbed a nearby chair and hit his assailant hard enough to knock the man unconscious. This earned him additional punishment and more time in isolation, but it also established that Hartmann wouldn't be intimidated by physical abuse, and that the Soviets would need different methods if they wanted to break him. More subtle efforts to convert him to communism followed, with political officers attempting to convince him that the Soviet system was superior and that Germany's future lay with the East rather than the West. But these ideological arguments found no purchase with a man who'd seen Soviet brutality firsthand and had no illusions about what the regime represented. Hartmann's position was straightforward, and he stated it clearly to anyone who asked. If after he was home in the West, the Soviets made him a normal contract offer, a business deal such as people signed every day all over the world, and if he liked the offer, then he would come back and work with them in accordance with the contract. But if they tried to put him to work under any form of coercion, then he would resist to his dying gasp. A principled stance, one the Soviets had no interest in accepting because they wanted compliant servants, not contractual partners. When other methods of persuasion failed, Hartmann went on hunger strike, choosing to starve rather than fold to Soviet demands, and the authorities allowed the strike to continue for 4 days before intervening by force-feeding him, shoving tubes down his throat and pumping nutrients directly into his stomach. The procedure was brutal and degrading, but Hartmann had made his point about how far he would go rather than cooperate. For more than 4 years, Hartmann remained in Soviet custody without formal charges being filed, moved between camps, and subjected to continued interrogation, but never actually put on trial for any specific offense. The Soviets seemed uncertain what to do with him, because while they wanted him for propaganda purposes or intelligence value, his refusal to cooperate made him useless for those goals, and keeping him imprisoned indefinitely without legal process created its own problems. December 24, 1949, Christmas Eve, finally brought formal arrest and charges of war crimes. 3 days later, on December 27, 1949, he was tried by a Soviet military court and found guilty of deliberately strafing 780 Soviet civilians in the village of Bryansk on June 23, 1943, and of destroying a bread factory in the same attack. And he was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor to be served in Soviet prison camps, with the sentence later increased to 25 years. The charges were completely fabricated. In research by post-war historians examining German and Soviet military records, showed that JG-52 didn't even fly on June 23, 1943, because weather conditions were too poor for operations, and the Soviet Fifth Air Army recorded no aircraft losses that day, meaning the bread factory destruction never happened, the civilian casualties never occurred, and the entire case was a malicious prosecution designed to provide legal cover for keeping Hartmann imprisoned because the Soviets couldn't admit they were simply holding him out of spite. 25 years meant Hartmann wouldn't see freedom until 1974 or 1975 if he survived that long, and survival in the Soviet Gulag system was far from guaranteed. moved through a series of camps and prisons, each one designed to break the spirit and destroy the body of anyone unlucky enough to be held there. The first major camp was near Moscow, where prisoners worked in a brick factory doing physical labor that was exhausting and dangerous. Hartmann was given no special treatment despite his fame as a pilot, and conditions were brutal with little food, minimal shelter, and constant beatings from guards who enjoyed inflicting pain on German prisoners, while winter temperatures dropped far below freezing, and the barracks provided almost no protection as prisoners huddled together for warmth, and woke to find that some had frozen to death during the night. From Moscow, Hartmann was transferred to Siberia and assigned to work in a coal mine, and if the Moscow camp had been bad, then the Siberian facility was hell on earth. Temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Protective clothing was inadequate, and the mine work was backbreaking labor that destroyed men's bodies and minds as prisoners descended into the earth each day and dug coal with inadequate tools and insufficient light, breathing coal dust that blackened their lungs and working in tunnels that collapsed regularly and buried workers alive. Hartmann survived by using the same discipline and focus that had made him successful as a fighter pilot, treating each day as a mission to be completed and refusing to give in to despair or hopelessness. Later, saying his love for Ursula sustained him mentally, that knowing she was waiting for him in Germany gave him a reason to endure. When death would have been easier, they were allowed to exchange letters, but correspondence was limited to 25 words per month, barely enough to say, "I am alive, I love you. Oh, please wait," and nothing more. The Soviets moved him to the Novocherkassk Gulag for a 5-month stint of especially harsh confinement, punishment for filing a complaint with the camp commander requesting an international inspection and an appeal trial. Both requests were thrown into the waste paper bin, and Hartmann was sent to an even more brutal facility as retaliation for daring to assert any rights as a prisoner. At one point, the Soviets surprisingly agreed to hold a new trial, and Hartmann allowed himself a flicker of hope that justice might prevail and his false conviction might be overturned. But the trial was held, and unsurprisingly, the court confirmed the original sentence in full, adding insult to injury by pretending this was a legitimate legal proceeding rather than a show trial with a predetermined outcome. Hartmann was then transferred to a camp in the Ural Mountains, the harshest facility yet, where conditions were so severe that many prisoners didn't survive more than a few months. Through all of this, Hartmann maintained his resistance to Soviet attempts at ideological conversion. Political officers visited regularly to lecture prisoners on the superiority of communism and the evils of Western capitalism, and prisoners who showed enthusiasm for the message received better treatment and extra rations, but Hartmann attended the mandatory sessions while showing no interest in the ideology, refused to participate in discussions, and made clear through his silence and his bearing that no amount of propaganda would change his convictions. The physical toll of 10 years in the camps was catastrophic. Hartmann suffered from chronic malnutrition that weakened his body and damaged his organs. He contracted dysentery multiple times and never fully recovered from the intestinal damage. And he accumulated untreated injuries from beatings and accidents that would cause him pain for the rest of his life, losing weight until he was gaunt and skeletal, while his teeth deteriorated from lack of proper nutrition and dental care. His health declined to the point where survival itself became uncertain. But he maintained his mental fitness through force of will, refusing to let the camps destroy his mind, even as they damaged his body. Thinking about flying constantly by mentally rehearsing aerobatic maneuvers and combat tactics, reliving successful missions, and analyzing mistakes from the past. He thought about Ursula waiting for him in West Germany and imagined their reunion and the life they would build together when this nightmare finally ended. Counting days and weeks and months became a way of maintaining some sense of order in the chaos of camp existence. What Hartmann didn't know during these years was that his son Erich Peter had died in 1948 at age 3. a child Hartmann had never seen and would never hold. The Soviets kept this information from him either out of cruelty or simply because they didn't care enough to inform him, and Ursula's letters couldn't convey such devastating news in the 25 words per month she was allowed to write, meaning Hartmann's suffering in the camps had cost him not just years of his life, but also any relationship with his firstborn child. The camps also featured moments of resistance and solidarity among prisoners that showed the Gulag system couldn't completely crush the human spirit. Prisoners organized work slowdowns when guards were especially brutal. They shared food with those too weak to work, and they maintained a sense of identity and dignity despite every effort to dehumanize them. And Hartmann participated in these acts of quiet defiance by using his status as a famous ace to boost morale among other German prisoners and showing through his example that resistance was possible even in the depths of the Gulag. March 5, 1953, brought news that Joseph Stalin had died, and prisoners across the Soviet camp system allowed themselves to hope that the dictator's death might bring changes in policy and perhaps even early releases. The hope proved premature, as Stalin's immediate successors maintained most of his policies, including the Gulag system. But over time, the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev began a process of de-Stalinization that would eventually affect foreign prisoners. In 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow for a summit with Premier Khrushchev to discuss normalizing relations between West Germany and the Soviet Union. And one of the key negotiating points was the release of remaining German prisoners of war still held in Soviet camps 10 years after the war had ended. Adenauer pushed hard on this issue because thousands of German families had loved ones who disappeared into the Soviet system and had been waiting years for any information about their fate. And Khrushchev agreed to release the last German prisoners as a gesture of goodwill and as part of the broader diplomatic normalization. And in October 1955, lists of names began circulating through the camps identifying prisoners who would be released and repatriated to Germany. Erich Hartmann's name appeared on one of those lists, and after 10 years and 5 months of imprisonment, he was finally told he would be going home. October 14, 1955, brought Hartmann walking out of Soviet captivity as part of the final wave of German prisoners returning home, the last Heimkehrer after more than a decade in hell. Survived solitary confinement, hunger strikes, forced labor, brutal cold, starvation rations, beatings, and 10.5 years of psychological torture. And he'd never broken, never cooperated, never given the Soviets what they wanted. The journey back to West Germany took days, as released prisoners were processed through various checkpoints and transit camps, and Hartmann spent that time trying to comprehend that his ordeal was actually ending and that he would soon see Ursula again. When he finally crossed into West Germany and was reunited with his wife, the emotion overwhelmed him. A decade of separation ending in an embrace that both of them had sometimes believed would never come. Ursula told him about their son Erich Peter's birth and death, 7 years of carrying that grief alone while Hartmann suffered in the camps, and the news devastated him, even though the child had been gone for 7 years already. A daughter he'd never met, Ursula Isabel, born February 23, 1957, more than a year after his release. I meant a new life and a second chance at fatherhood after the tragedy of losing the son he'd never known. The physical reunion with his family couldn't erase what the camps had done to Hartmann's body. Gaunt and weak, his health permanently damaged by malnutrition and untreated illness, and he would suffer from the effects of his imprisonment for the rest of his life. But his spirit was intact, his principles uncompromised, and his refusal to cooperate with Soviet coercion stood as a testament to his character. January 1997, more than 3 years after Hartmann's death, brought the chief military prosecutor in Moscow reviewing his case at the request of the Russian Federation following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The review concluded that Hartmann had been wrongly convicted of fabricated charges, that the war crimes accusations were false, and that his imprisonment had been unjust, and the Russian government officially acquitted him of all charges and declared the conviction void. Justice delivered 4 years too late for Hartmann to know about it, but still meaningful as an acknowledgement that he'd been right to resist. Erich Hartmann had survived the Gulag without breaking, had endured a decade of suffering without compromising his principles, and had emerged with his integrity intact. A victory of a different sort than his aerial achievements, quieter and less celebrated but no less significant, the Blonde Knight had faced the Black Devil's own prison system and had refused to yield. But his battles weren't over yet. In 1956, 1 year after his release from Soviet captivity, Erich Hartmann made a decision that surprised many who knew him. At age 34, after spending the previous decade in prison camps and suffering permanent health damage from malnutrition and abuse, he chose to rejoin military service by enlisting in the newly established West German Luftwaffe, the Air Force of the Federal Republic of Germany that was being rebuilt as part of NATO's defense structure against Soviet expansion. The decision spoke to Hartmann's fundamental identity as a pilot and as a soldier, because despite everything he'd endured, he still saw military service as his calling and still believed Germany needed defending. The new Luftwaffe was careful to distinguish itself from its Nazi-era predecessor with strict democratic oversight and integration into NATO command structures, and Hartmann saw joining this force as serving his country rather than serving a regime. The West German military welcomed him enthusiastically because his skills and experience were exactly what the new Air Force needed as it stood up from nothing, and his reputation as the world's greatest ace brought prestige and credibility to the rebuilding effort. But first, Hartmann needed training on modern equipment because aviation had advanced dramatically during his decade away, with jets replacing propeller aircraft as the primary fighters, and everything from tactics to cockpit layouts had changed. The Americans provided training facilities and instructors as part of NATO cooperation, and in 1957, Hartmann traveled to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona to learn American jet aircraft and procedures. The training course lasted 60 days and consisted of 33 hours of flight time in the Lockheed T-33 trainer, followed by 47 hours in the Republic F-84F Thunderstreak fighter bomber. And Hartmann absorbed the new knowledge eagerly, despite the challenges of adapting to jet aircraft after years flying piston engine fighters. The T-33 was a gentle introduction to jets, with its docile handling and forgiving flight characteristics, and Hartmann found the transition easier than he'd expected because good flying skills transferred across aircraft types. The F-84F was more demanding with higher speeds and different energy management requirements, but Hartmann's tactical instincts adapted, and he proved he could still fly and fight at the highest levels, despite his age and his time away from aviation. June 6, 1959, brought Hartmann's appointment as the first Geschwader Commodore, the wing commander of Jagdgeschwader 71, Richthofen, West Germany's first all-jet fighter unit, and a squadron that bore the name of the Red Baron from World War I. The appointment made Hartmann responsible for building the unit from scratch, establishing procedures and training standards, and preparing the wing for its NATO mission of defending West German airspace against potential Soviet attack. JG-71 was initially equipped with Canadair F-86 Sabres, and to the license-built Canadian version of the legendary American fighter that had dominated the skies over Korea in the early 1950s. The Sabre was a beautiful aircraft with swept wings and excellent handling, a joy to fly and a capable fighter, and Hartmann immediately had his aircraft painted with his distinctive black tulip nose art from the Eastern Front, creating a direct link to his wartime achievements and reminding everyone that the Blonde Knight was back in the air where he belonged. Hartmann's command of JG-71 lasted from June 1959 to May 1962, 3 years during which he shaped the unit's culture and capabilities, and by all accounts, he was an effective commander who understood both the technical and human aspects of leading fighter pilots. Emphasizing the fundamentals of air combat that had served him so well during the war, he taught his pilots about energy management and situational awareness and the importance of discipline, and instilled in them the principle that a leader's first duty was protecting those under his command. But storm clouds were gathering because the West German government had decided to equip the Luftwaffe with a new fighter to replace the aging Sabres. And the aircraft they chose was the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. The F-104 was a radical design, a missile with a man in it, according to some descriptions, built for speed and high-altitude interception with a tiny straight wing, powerful engine, and unforgiving flight characteristics that demanded precision and left no margin for error. Hartmann opposed the F-104 from the moment he learned of the procurement decision, and his opposition was based on careful analysis rather than nostalgia for older aircraft, already recommending to Luftwaffe Inspector General Josef Kamm-Huber back in 1957 that Germany should buy a small number of any new aircraft type first, evaluate them thoroughly under realistic conditions, identify problems and limitations, and only then commit to large-scale procurement once the aircraft had proven itself suitable for German needs and German pilots. This measured approach was ignored in favor of political and industrial considerations, and Germany committed to purchasing 900 F-104 Starfighters in what would become one of the largest fighter procurement programs in European history. Hartmann watched this decision unfold with growing alarm because everything he learned about the F-104 suggested it was fundamentally unsuited for the Luftwaffe's mission and pilot training pipeline. The Starfighter was designed for high-altitude interception in clear weather over the southwestern United States, for pilots with extensive jet experience attacking bomber formations at extreme altitudes where its tiny wing and powerful engine gave it tremendous performance. But the Luftwaffe's mission in Central Europe involved low-altitude operations in marginal weather conditions, and the majority of German pilots had limited jet experience and were transitioning from simpler aircraft to one of the most demanding fighters ever built. Hartmann considered the F-104 fundamentally flawed and unsafe for its intended role. And he made his opinions known to his superiors through official channels and unofficial conversations, pointing out that the wing loading was too high for low-altitude maneuvering, that the engine was prone to compressor stalls during aggressive maneuvering, that the ejection seat had known reliability problems, and that the aircraft's landing characteristics were unforgiving enough that even experienced pilots were crashing during routine approaches. His warnings fell on deaf ears because the procurement decision was already made and changing course would have been politically embarrassing and financially costly. JG-71 transitioned from Sabres to Starfighters, and Hartmann watched with mounting frustration as his predictions began coming true. Crashes increased, and German pilots started dying in an aircraft that was killing them through design flaws rather than enemy action. The statistics were damning. Between introduction of the F-104 into Luftwaffe service and its eventual retirement, the West German Air Force suffered 282 crashes that killed 116 pilots in non-combat accidents, an absolutely catastrophic loss rate that earned the aircraft the nickname Witwenmacher, the Widowmaker, and pilots' wives lived in fear every time their husbands went flying because the chances of not coming home were unacceptably high for peacetime operations. The Lockheed scandal made things worse when investigations revealed that Lockheed had paid a $10 million bribe to the West German defense minister to secure the purchase contract for 900 aircraft. The entire procurement had been corrupt from the start, based on bribery rather than sound military judgment, and Hartmann's opposition to the aircraft was vindicated by events even as his superiors continued insisting the program would succeed once pilots learned to handle the demanding aircraft. Hartmann refused to be a good soldier and stay quiet about problems he could see killing his pilots and his colleagues. Voicing his criticism publicly, writing reports detailing the F-104's unsuitability for Luftwaffe missions, and clashing repeatedly with senior officers who wanted him to stop making trouble and accept the program. General Werner Panitsky, who succeeded Kammhuber as inspector of the Luftwaffe, summed up the military leadership's view when he said Erich is a good pilot, but not a good officer. The statement was revealing because it showed the military bureaucracy valued obedience over competence and compliance over speaking truth, and Hartmann possessed neither the temperament nor the inclination to sacrifice his principles for career advancement. Survived 10 years in Soviet prison camps without compromising his convictions, and he wasn't about to start compromising now when German lives were at stake. In 1970, at age 48, Erich Hartmann was forced into early retirement from the Bundeswehr. The official reason was never explicitly stated, but everyone understood the real cause was his opposition to the F-104 program and his refusal to stop criticizing procurement decisions and safety issues, and he could have stayed quiet and served another decade. He could have reached higher rank and collected a better pension. But Hartmann chose principle over career security, just as he'd chosen resistance over collaboration in Soviet camps. Hartmann's forced retirement was professional punishment for being right, for seeing what the bureaucrats refused to acknowledge, and for caring more about dead pilots than about preserving institutional face. History would vindicate him completely as the F-104's catastrophic safety record became undeniable, and as the Lockheed scandal exposed the corruption behind the procurement, but vindication came too late to save his military career. From 1971 to 1974, Hartmann worked as a civilian flight instructor at Hangelar near Bonn, teaching others the skills and judgment that had kept him alive through 1,404 combat missions. In Alsace, and he also flew in aerobatic demonstrations with other wartime pilots, including Adolf Galland. These were good years in their own way, with flying for the pure joy of it, without the burden of combat or the constraints of military bureaucracy, reconnecting with old friends and sharing stories with people who understood what they'd all lived through. Giving interviews about his war experiences, he cooperated with authors writing his biography and provided detailed personal recollections that helped historians understand the reality of air combat on the Eastern Front. The 1970 publication of The Blonde Knight of Germany by Raymond Tolliver and Trevor Constable brought his story to English-speaking audiences, and Hartmann participated actively in promoting the book and correcting misconceptions about the Luftwaffe and its pilots. In all these interviews and appearances, Hartmann maintained a consistent humility about his achievements, refusing to glorify war or portray himself as anything more than a skilled pilot who'd done his job during a terrible time. His most famous quote captured this perspective perfectly when he said, "I was a fighter pilot who shot down 352 aircraft, that's all." Saw himself as a technician who'd mastered a difficult craft, not as a hero or a Superman, and he was careful never to romanticize the killing, even though he'd been extraordinarily good at it. The historical debate about his victory total continued throughout his retirement, with some historians questioning whether he'd actually shot down 352 aircraft, or whether the real number was substantially lower. Soviet historian Dmitry Kazanov claimed Hartmann had only destroyed 70 to 80 aircraft, a radical downward revision that sparked heated debate among aviation historians. Other researchers, including Jean-Yves Laurent and Hans Ring, criticized Kazanov's methodology severely by pointing out that his analysis contained false and misleading information about missions and dates, and they defended the German records as fundamentally reliable. The German Federal Archives contain documentation for 352 aerial victory claims filed by Hartmann, and while some historians suggested the actual number might be lower due to overclaiming, nobody credible believed it was as low as Kazanov claimed. The truth probably lies somewhere between the extremes. Comparing Hartmann's claims against Soviet loss records suggests some overclaiming occurred. WWII, which was common among all air forces during the war because in the chaos of combat, multiple pilots often shot at the same aircraft and all claimed credit, and a realistic estimate might put Hartmann's actual kills at 250 to 300 aircraft, still an unmatched total and still more than double the nearest Western Allied ace, but below the officially credited 352. What remained undisputed was Hartmann's tactical excellence, his survival through the most intense aerial combat of the war, his record of never losing a wingman, and his principled resistance during captivity. Whether he shot down 352 aircraft or 250, whether every single claim was accurate or some were duplicates, the fundamental achievement stood unchallenged and unchallengeable. February 23, 1957, Nike had brought the birth of Hartmann's daughter, Ursula Isabel, and she grew up knowing her father as a man who'd lived an extraordinary life, but who approached fatherhood with the same quiet competence he'd brought to everything else. Devoted to his family, faithful to Ursula, who'd waited for him through the impossible years of his imprisonment, and determined to give his daughter the stable childhood that war and captivity had denied him the chance to provide his son. The long-term health effects from his 10 years in Soviet camps never fully healed. Hartmann suffered from chronic digestive problems related to the dysentery and malnutrition he'd endured. His teeth continued deteriorating from the damage done by inadequate nutrition during his 20s and 30s, and he carried injuries that caused him pain for the rest of his life. And the Gulag had marked him permanently, both physically and psychologically, though he bore these burdens quietly, without complaint. September 20th, 1993 brought the end. Erich Hartmann died at his home in Weil im Schönbuch, Germany, at age 71 from natural causes likely related to a hereditary heart condition that had also affected his father, and he'd lived 48 years after his final combat mission, raised a daughter, built a second career as an instructor, and seen Germany transformed from the ruins of the Third Reich into a democratic nation integrated with its former enemies. In 2016, 23 years after his death, Hartmann's former unit, Jagdgeschwader 71, honored him by painting one of their Eurofighter Typhoon jets in his distinctive black tulip color scheme. The gesture linked the modern Luftwaffe to its wartime predecessor through the symbol of its greatest ace, acknowledging both the achievement and the complexity of that history. Erich Hartmann had been many things across his 71 years. The world's deadliest fighter pilot with 352 credited victories, the unbreakable prisoner who survived the Gulag without compromising his principles, and the principled officer who sacrificed his career to speak truth about a dangerous aircraft. The husband who endured a decade of separation, the father who never met his firstborn son, the instructor who taught others to survive in the air, and the humble man who insisted he'd just been a pilot doing his job. His record as an ace will almost certainly never be broken because modern air combat has changed too fundamentally with missiles and radar and beyond visual range engagements replacing the close-in dogfighting that produced such high scores during World War II. But his example of integrity under pressure, of principles maintained despite consequences, and of competence combined with humility remains as relevant today as it was when he walked out of Soviet camps in 1955 or when he challenged the F-104 procurement in 1970. The Blonde Knight of Germany flew his final mission in 1993, but the legend endures.